the original spring influencer. Let's paint a robin. Hello, welcome to Wild Developments. My name is Lauren, and my mission is to help you connect with nature through art, storytelling, and some creative exploration. Today, we're going to talk about spring and the robin. Let's dive in. Materials needed for this project: watercolor paper, our outline, pencil, a pen, a brush, a paint palette, our paint, paper towel, spray bottle, masking tape, and a container for our water. In a little bit more detail about some of our materials here, I am using a Micron number 8. It is a waterproof pen, and that way when we put our lines down, we can paint over it and don't have to worry about the outline moving and going anywhere. I'm also using a number 12 round brush. It's big enough I can get large areas pretty quickly, but I can also go in with this fine tip and get some of those smaller details. For the paper, I'm using the Lita Art Supply. It is 25% cotton cold press, and it's 140-pound paper. It is a good, affordable paper for this project. And then I am going to be using a light box to transfer the image onto our watercolor paper. Make sure you line it up nice, and also that you tape down your image. You're also going to make sure you have nice dry hands. If you have oily hands and you touch the paper, it will repel the paint. You'll have little fingerprints all over your paper. So I'm going to fast forward this part. All right, we are ready to paint. So the outline was a little bit bigger than the page, so his foot got cut off a little bit, and that is okay. If I wanted to go back in after I'm done painting the bird, maybe I'll add some grass or some background or something. It would look just fine. We're going to take our paint colors and put it on the palette. I've got enough white gouache. Probably not going to use too much of that today, probably just in the highlight in the eye. We'll leave the white spots on around like the eye and the head white of the paper. If we accidentally paint over it, you could always use that white gouache to cover it up. So for the body of the bird, I'm going to open it up over on this side of the tray because sometimes it'll flake as you're opening it up. I'm using a neutral tint for the body of the robin. It's kind of like a nice gray shade. I had a watercolor instructor telling his usual students that they're not allowed to use neutral tint for shadow and certain things. And come on, lid, go back on. I guess they were using that a lot, and I had never even heard of that color before. So I decided to check it out. It is a good neutral shade to use. For the belly, I'm going to do burnt sienna. It's kind of got some orange, reddish hue to it, which was similar to the robin, I felt. I do have a little bit of orange. Don't think I'm going to add it. You don't have to for this project. Ooh. I'm using burnt sienna. Actually, my son's favorite color is orange. And he told me that brown is just darker orange. I've been in art schools on and off throughout my entire life and taken various art classes, and never once have I heard that before until him. So it is technically an orange. It's a nice kind of rusty color for that belly. For the eyeball, I'm going to use Burnt Umber, which I already have on the palette right here. So I'm not going to squeeze any of that out. And then this Hansa Yellow Deep I have on the palette right here. That is what I'm going to use on the beak. And now we are ready to begin. So I'm going to start right here on the legs because they're like a very light gray. Oh, I did not light my candle. Oh, also, look at this amazing contraption my son made me to hold my brushes. He 3D printed that. It is so cool. It matches my little setup over here. It's all blue. All right, now we're ready to paint. So very light gray on his little legs there. They kind of look like little pantaloons. I think that's the right word. They're like little pants on his legs. I woke up early, so I made a goofy moon. All right, so just very lightly on those legs. We'll add some shadows to it later on after it's dry. The reason I wanted to paint the robin now is because when I think of spring, I think of robins, and they are actually known to herald in spring, although in most cases they don't migrate. They stay in, their area all winter long. However, they do change habits from winter into spring. So in the winter time, they're eating berries and different fruits. They're hanging out in trees, like roosting. And then in the springtime, they switch up their diet and they start eating worms. So that's why you see them running around in the yard eating worms. So it's a good indicator that it is spring when you see them running around your yard starting to eat birds or worms. We are going to paint in that neutral tint on his back. And in the reference photo, you notice that the head is a dark gray. So we'll do that, but we'll keep in mind that these little spots we're going to keep white. Now males will have a darker gray on top of their head, and their bellies are a lot brighter orange, and the females are going to be lighter. You see that a lot in bird species where the female is lighter than the male or brown, some sort of color that'll blend in to their surroundings, because the female usually protecting that nest. And the male will go off and find food, and penguins, they will take turns. Not entirely sure with robins, but I'll look that up and leave a little note at the bottom of the screen. Probably say something like, this is editing Lauren. Future Lauren, hey, how's it going? Hope it's warmer. It's currently in the 20s. We've had snow for, I don't know, probably like 2 weeks now. My hands are so dry. I hope you're seeing robins now. So this is the American robin. They're a very common species of bird in North America. when European settlers came over to America, they thought that this guy looked like their robin. And that's why they named him that. However, this species is in the thrush family. No, I got the eye wet. Got some paint in the eye. I just used my finger to dab it up real quick. So I definitely think of this species when I think of spring. I also think of this species when I hear the saying, the early bird gets the worm, because I think out of all the birds I've ever seen, and I am middle-aged, and we get obsessed with birds when we're in our middle age. I think the robin is what I see the most pulling worms out of the ground. But maybe that's because, they hang out in lawns and stuff and more easily accessible bird to see. But you'll notice that they tilt their head before they snatch up a worm, and they actually can see the worms moving around. So they're using their sight. For the longest time I thought they were using maybe their ears, and they were tilting their head so they could hear the worms moving in the ground. We're just getting this base layer down. Neutral gray tint all over, and then we'll go back in and darken some things up. And then after some things dry, we'll add some shadows, some of the details in the feathers and things like that to help them really pop. Remember to be careful around these little patches of white by his eye. Now looking up close at that robin's beak, you can tell it kind of looks like tweezers, which makes sense. You're going to need that in order to pull a worm out of the ground. We've also, in previous tutorials, done a penguin. They have a nice sharp beak, so they got to catch fish. And then the flamingo had that curved hook-like beak because they're getting shrimp out of the water. So you can tell a lot about a bird by looking at their beak and their coloration. All little clues that tell a story about the animal. I'm getting some darker, more milk-like consistency, neutral tint on my brush because I do want his head to be darker. We're making this a male robin with a darker head, and he'll have a brighter belly. If you wanted to paint a female robin, you do nice light gray on the head and on the belly. Make sure it's not as bright. I'm doing kind of these little like squigglies to give the impression of feathers. And again, over here where that gray meets the orange, just nice squigglies. They've got tons of feathers. You don't want to have to sit there and paint every single one. That would take a long time. I think that would just suck all the fun and enjoyment out of painting. But that's just me. If you find that fun, you can go for it. All right. So I like how the head's looking. I am going to add a couple little, like just squigglies, give the impression of some feathers. And then kind of underneath where those lines are that we already sketched out. So while the top of the head is drying, I don't want to go in quite yet with the belly because I don't want to get the wet paint next to the different color wet paint because they'll bleed into each other. So we can work on adding some shadow in some of those wings, and some of the feathers on the wing. Just more like a tea consistency with that paint. And go right underneath some of these feathers here. It doesn't have to be perfect. Some of these lines in the tail. Just kind of giving the impression of a shadow or suggestion of a shadow. And then on some of these tips of the wings, it's really dark. So I'm just adding a little bit of squiggly color, wiggling my brush back and forth. You want it to be a little bit darker than the shadow was that you were putting down. That way the eye can differentiate between the two. And then this one feather looks a little bit darker than the others. Maybe darken that up. I'm gonna make the tail a little bit darker. I'm really going in with a kind of a dry brush, just kind of placing in the color. And some of these are a little bit darker, so I'm going to go in with a thicker paint and just, again, kind of dry brush in. I'm going to smooth it out a little bit, because I didn't really like how that looked. Sometimes, depending on the paper, you'll get the effect that you want. If not, you can fix it. I'll just blend it out. It does look darker right along here. So thankfully this paper dries pretty quick. So I can go back in and fix whatever I did quickly. So I think I'm gonna go in with some white gouache later and just add some highlights. So I also see there's some like highlights on the tips of some of these wings over here and right here. So we can add in some highlights and some details later. And I'll probably add some white right back in there. I'm gonna blend this out a little bit. I'm using little strokes because that'll give the impression of some feathers. I'm gonna leave that light right there. It'll be like the sun hitting right on the top of the wing. Coffee. Okay. So I'm gonna take a hair dryer and blow dry this area because it's about time to move into the belly area. Actually, you know what we could do is work on his feet. So we'll do that so we don't have to take a break. And kind of show how to piece that together without needing a hair dryer. So I am going to take a very watered down burnt sienna. And then also I'll show you some watered down burnt sienna and some neutral tint to make the leg color. If you have, I have this pink, and it is almost like a pinky but I'm going to go in with this color since those are the colors that I currently have. Let's say you're out in the field, you've got a limited palette, you got to make do with what you got. I mean, ideally, if you're out in the field with a limited palette, you've got your 3 primary colors, red, blue, and yellow, and then you can mix up whichever color you like. But for this project, we've only got about 4 colors and some wash, which actually 4 colors might be the most colors we've had in a project so far. I used to be so enamored with palettes that have tons and tons of colors. Like, I think one palette I had 48 different colors. And sometimes it gets a little overwhelming to know which color to choose. That's why I always, like for this project, I took the colors that I had and I swatched them out to see which one I liked and compared it against the reference photo. And I did that for the manatee and the snake, the shark, the salamander. So it's always good to have some scrap paper and test it out and see what it looks like when it dries and test out different techniques that you're doing. But I've challenged myself this year to have like a signature palette, and I'm only using 12 colors. And I did a couple bright pops of colors, and then I did a couple like primary colors so that I can have some nice fun colors, but also I can still mix. And that way by keeping my 12 colors, your piece looks a little bit more succinct and put together. All right, I think our bird's coming together. We'll add some shadows in the leg in a little bit. It looks like the head is just about dry. So I'm gonna go in with some burnt sienna and make a little puddle. Just go in and paint the belly. Be careful of those edges there. We could go back in later and touch it up, but I'd rather not. Just using that tip of my brush to really get in to those areas. And the other thing we could have done is we could have started with the belly and done that first, but that was not the order we went in today. So if we started with the belly, if we went over the line, then we could have just covered it with the neutral tint. That's okay. There's no right or wrong way. And if you do go over the line a little bit, that is okay too. I learned from a watercolor class I took this summer that we were painting boats and like sitting in the grass. And he's like, if you get a little grass color on the boat, don't worry about it, or boat color on the grass. Like when you're next to something, whatever color it is reflecting off, especially like in the sunlight. Just going in and getting all little details and keeping it to little strokes. It'll mimic those feathers on the belly. So I'm just going to go in and kind of dab, dab, dab. Ooh. Just as I'm going up, I dab, dab, dab. And then it'll kind of give the impression of a bunch of little belly feathers. I like doing that while it's still wet, so it kind of spreads out and blends nicely. I'll have to look up and I'll report back. Editing Lauren. I'm giving her lots of work today. Yeah, when robins have little babies, they lay bright blue eggs. Which is interesting. I wonder why. Because it seems like that would be hard to camouflage that beautiful bright blue. So there must be some reason. Some robins are pretty good at making nests. And it's like the rock dove. I keep seeing memes online where it's like, it looks like just sticks thrown together. It's like an egg in the middle, and the poor little rock dove trying its best. Going in with a little bit thicker on top, a little thicker paint, and just again, dab, 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 dab. Then letting it spread out. It's kind of lighter right there, and that is how it looks in the reference photo, so I'll lift it just a little bit. I'm going to go in with a little bit darker and just add a little bit more down here because it is darker here on the bird. I did not paint his toenails. And the toenails look to be a light gray, so we can take some of our gray and go in and paint those nails. When you hear a robin sing, They have a pretty song, and it sounds like Cheerily Cheer Up. That's another reason why I think they're great for springtime. As you see them running around eating those worms, and they're singing Cheerily Cheer Up, which I definitely do when it is warmer out. And while we're working with this lighter gray, a tea-like consistency, I am gonna add in some shadow. So if you look on the reference photo at the back leg, this part is all in a shadow, and then right here is in a shadow. And actually, we'll add some of those details in the leg first. So in the leg, it's like a little bit darker back here. And then up in the front a little bit, kind of wiggle that brush around. Bird legs are kind of, I don't know, they're kind of ugly when you look at them up close. Bird feet. Just kind of making a bunch of squiggles. You don't have to be exact. Just giving that impression of what wrinkly bird feet look like. They almost look like witch hands or something. All right, so that back toe is going to be shaded too. So I'll add a little shadow right there. I lay down a little bit of a lighter shade first and then a little darker closer to where they touch and let it spread out. It gives a nice soft shadow. All right, that part's dry, so we'll add in the shadow. Goes to about right here, and it's kind of rounded because the leg's rounded. So we'll round it off a little bit and then just drop in your shadow. And careful not to touch that belly with the orange if it is still wet. So we don't want them to bleed together. I'm also going to, while this shadow part's still wet, go in with a little darker shade right up against the body and then let it blend out. Okay. It's also there also seems to be some shadow right underneath here. I'm making it jaggedy to give the impression that there are feathers on top. And then right back here, kind of curving a little bit. And before we do any shadow, because there's some shadow right along the wing, before we do that, because it still needs to dry a little bit, we can go in and work on the beak and the eyeball. So, for the beak, using that deep yellow shade, and just covering the whole beak. while it's still wet, and clean off my brush, get a little bit of that light gray. And I'm gonna go in at the top of the beak. Just let it spread out. And then over by the nostril too. It's got some gray shade kind of under here. And darken it up right at the very top. I'm gonna let that dry and then I'll darken it in a minute. It also looks like inside the nose, it's giving like a darker reflection, almost an orange. So I'm gonna add some orange just on the inside nostril there. And that black part of the eye, I am gonna color in with my waterproof marker. And then let that dry. I remembered this time. Insert cheering sounds. Okay, so now that the belly's dry, I'm going to add some shadow right underneath the wing. So we got a little bit of shadow coming out just boop, underneath that. And right up against the wing. I need to darken that up. And it kind of goes down like that. And it also is kind of dark right there. I'm going to add a little bit of shadow right here. Okay, now that the beak is dry, I'm going to add a little bit of darker spot right there. Now his eye is a darker brown, so I'm going in with that burnt umber. Got burnt umber and burnt sienna today. Everything's burnt. Everything's burnt today. Editing Lauren, if you're feeling adventurous, look up why it's called burnt sienna and umber and raw sienna and umber. I gotta know what the difference is. It's a little darker than I wanted it to be, so I'm gonna lighten it up by just kind of drying my brush on a paper towel and mopping up some of that color, because then I like to go in with a darker, like thicker amount of paint just on the tip of the brush and go in along the edges and kind of do small flicks into the eye to help create all those little like grooves and stuff and different dimensions that you see when you're looking in the eye. Actually, that eye is a lot darker when you're looking at the reference photo. So you know what? I'm gonna leave that kind of dark. And I'll go in with my neutral tint really thick. And we'll do that around the outside edge of the eye. And we'll just let it kind of mix together on the page. And it'll help create a darker brown. And I will have to go in and touch up the center of the eye with a marker again. But that's okay. Okay. I am happier with the color of the eye now. It is going to lighten up as it dries though. So while that's drying, we'll go in with some white gouache. So make sure you clean off your brush really well. I'm going to spray this down. I'm going to spray this down. There's water. Why aren't you working? Okay. We'll pick up some white gouache. Make sure we get a nice thick puddle of it. I'm going to dry my brush, just the barrel. I'm going to go in. So this little feather that's sticking out right here was whiter. So I'm just going to add a little bit of white here. Oh no. Yeah, one little bristle sticking up. If it doesn't go back, the trick with that, if you ever have bristles that stick out, they're not acting right, they're not laying natural, you take hot water and I just pour it over. You can even like kind of swirl it around in some hot water. I just take hot water right from the kettle and pour it over. And that usually seems to do the trick, but I feel like I'm getting to be on the last legs on this brush. So some of these little feathers have some white, so I'm just adding it right on the tip and squiggling my brush around. And underneath where we drew with a marker, I'm adding some white. So we're doing it on these feathers and then on these feathers. Now I could have just left that white from the white of the paper, or even use some, I'm masking fluid And maybe in a future project, we'll play around with some masking fluid. It takes a little bit to get used to, but it is fun to play with. And sometimes I just like the way the white looks laying on top. I feel like it adds a little bit of realism to it, especially like the salamander painting and things like that. It helps to add some dimension. Also, right under the beak, there are some white feathers. So I'm just gonna go in and flick, flick, flick. You might have to go over it a couple times. The other thing I am going to do is right on the outside edge of where we left it white, is kind of add some just little flicks so that it gives the impression of feathers instead of blobs. So just nice little pointed. Yeah. I like that better. Cool. He's looking like a bird. Now, I do need to still a tiny bit wet. I'm going to dry that and I'll be right back. I'm back. Just adding that black back in. It's still slightly wet. Okay. So I'm going to add some highlight into the eye. So we're going in right here at the top. Don't overwork it. But by going over that little part that's black and the little part that's brown, and you can still kind of see through it, it really adds that where it looks like it is a reflection in the eye. And then as that's drying, I'm going to take much thicker white gouache. I really want it to be bright. And right in the center towards the top, add a darker spot of white. And that really just adds some life to our little robin. So there you have it. We're all done. Congratulations. All right, guys, congratulations on painting your robin. Make sure that you sign your piece. It is never complete until it has your signature. And when it does, there is no more going back and touching it up. It is finished. Congratulations again. And if you've learned anything about robins or painting, please let it inspire you to do something positive for nature. And until next time, get outside, see what develops, and stay wild.